Many of our regular viewers have heard me repetitively use a phrase that I find quite potent and powerful. And it comes from a terrible period in the history of the world, which is, the statement goes, if one closes one's eyes to the past, one becomes blind to the future. Tonight's show is about racism. And in order to begin this program, I would like to take a little journey back to the past. In 1911, this was one moment in the history of Kentucky. A group of lower-class Caucasians dragged a black man from off the streets into a theater. They threw him up on the stage. On the rafter, they threw a rope, and they hung him. To combat evil to evil, they charged admission for people to come in and watch. And those who paid for the most expensive seats, they had the luxury of throwing tomatoes at the dead man. It seems a little bit shocking, maybe greatly shocking, but if you look at history of 1911 and in that period, it's not so shocking, because the three #1 best-selling books from 1901 to 1911 were these: The Negro, a Menace to American Civilization; The Negro, a Beast by Charles Carroll; The American Negro as a Dependent, Defective, Delinquent by Charles McCord. Three #1 best-selling books in the United States. In the early 1900s, there was a newspaper article reporting that President Grover Cleveland had invited a Negro into the White House. In the newspaper, the president responded to this rumor: "It so happens that I have never in my official position, either when sleeping or waking, alive or dead, on my head or on my heels, dined, lunched, supped, or invited to a reception at the White House any colored man, woman, or child." The point of this is that in the early 1900s in this country of ours, racism was rampant. Towards the end of this century, has it gotten any better is the question we must ask. One of the #1 best-selling books on the New York Times is a book called The Bell Curve, which the New York Times has called racial pornography, and the Atlantic Constitution has quoted as bigotry in the guise of academic robes. Recently, the National Conference of Christians and Jews did a survey. In this survey, and if Carl, you will roll the survey showed what the blacks, the Hispanics, and the Asians thought of one another. And as you can see, 49% and 68% of Asians think that Hispanics tend to have bigger families than they can support. Would you go to the next? 40% Hispanics and 42% blacks agree that the Chinese, Koreans, and Japanese are unscrupulous, crafty, and devious in business. 53% Asians and 51% Hispanics think that blacks are more likely to commit crimes of violence. One of the #1 monographs printed recently was after in 1991, a black youth confessed to stabbing a Hasidic Jew in New York. He was acquitted by an all-African-American jury. The night of his acquittal, despite his confession, the jury, the now exonerated assailant, and his attorney had a big celebratory dinner. That night, a man by the name of Khalid Abdul Mohammed gave this quote to the newspapers: "The so-called Jew is a European strain of people who crawled around on all fours in the caves and in the hills of Europe, eating each other. Jews are the bloodsuckers of the black nation. That's why you call yourselves Rubenstein, Goldstein, and Silverstein, because you've been stealing rubies and gold and silver all over the earth." Now, people may ask, before we begin tonight's program officially, why have I brought all this in together? Because from 1911 to now, we have had many movements to try to combat racism. Racism of one group towards another, whether Caucasians to blacks, blacks to Jews, Hispanics to Koreans, Koreans to Vietnamese. Racism still, in this day and age, in 1996, is rampant despite the numerous acts that our governments have passed, despite the over 500 civil rights organizations we have in this country. So tonight's show is hopefully designed to show us why we've come from where we've come, and have we gone anywhere, and what is the psychological, sociological, physiological, and perhaps even more important than anything, the spiritual solution to this deadly disease called racism. So in trying to find a guest tonight, I wanted someone who could speak about this evil disease called racism on all of those different levels. And to do so, I sort of made a list, and I thought, I've got to have someone who's kind of intelligent, got to know someone who perhaps has had first-hand experience about racism, someone who has first-hand experience of triumphing over racism, someone who has an international, non-biased, non-prejudicial viewpoint about this deadly disease. Primarily, I chose this person because she has been someone that I have held in high honor and high esteem for all of this time that I have known her. And so she flew in today to Reno, Nevada, her first visit, and she is Dr. Wilma Ellis. And so she's here to join us today. And I thank you so much for coming here.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
Little long-winded introduction, but the viewers are used to me. But it sort of sets the pace. Is you've been around this country since the moment you've been born, and you've traveled around this world. So go back to my first premise. I am assuming that you have seen racism firsthand.
Well, thank you very much, Joe, and I'm very happy to be here. And Reno is a beautiful city and a friendly city, and I'm delighted to be with you. And when you started with 1911, it reminded me of some of the really ghastly details, because what many Americans of any color don't realize is that that was the period of more lynchings than any other period in American history. It was in the early 1900s that we had so many lynchings, and those were the times that prompted the different organizations to come together and to fight this awful, terrible racism that was unbridled at that time. We didn't have the laws to back us up. We didn't have anything that would be helpful except people running for their lives. That's what we had, only that. And as a result, it was a very, very awful time. I've known families who came to West, and when you get to know the family very well, you find out that the reason they came West was because they were trying to stay one step ahead of the law. But they weren't criminals. One man I knew who moved from Alexandria, Louisiana, to Los Angeles with his family in the middle of the night. Why did he leave? Because he had the nerve to try to start a black baseball team in Alexandria, Louisiana, and there was no white man behind him. And that was completely out of the question. And he had to get out of town simply because he was trying to start a baseball team in Alexandria. Now, that wasn't that long ago. That wasn't 1911. That was more like 1950-something. And the stories go on about this kind of activity all over the country. And another thing that's important to realize is that everybody thinks all that happened in the South. It did not. It did not. We moved from Illinois to Arizona in the 30s, and I remember clearly as a little child hearing my mother and father talk about what had to happen right here in the western states. I remember one night when I was a little girl, a group of men came to see my father. These were African American community leaders, let's say. And the issue that they discussed that night was the fact that in Phoenix they were going to build a new bus terminal. And the proposal had been put forth that that bus terminal be segregated. And these men had come together to make sure that it was not segregated, because, and it's interesting to note also that the way it would have been segregated would be for whites only, and the African Americans, the Hispanics, and the Indians, they get to sit on this side, you see, but away from the whites. And they won that battle. What happens when you live long enough is that you have many, many horror stories. But I have to know that it is getting better. I have to know that. Because if I don't, I think that people who are senior citizens will lose their minds.
Was there a moment when you were a little girl that you suddenly woke up one day, going to school or whatever, and stood there and there was that moment when racism really became a major reality to you as an individual?
Yes, but it wasn't when I was going to school one day. One night, our family was traveling by car from Phoenix to Los Angeles, and we were in Blythe, Arizona. And I had a terrible dilemma when I was a child. You couldn't put me in any car without me getting sick. I always got sick. And of course, when a child gets sick, then afterwards you have to eat, you know. And I remember my mother going to a restaurant, just a little diner, to see if they had soda crackers, because that's all I could have. And I remember her hesitation at the door, because in order to get those soda crackers, she had to go to the back door. And for a little child, that kind of recollection you just don't forget. But you see, that's not all bad. It is terrible, but for me it isn't all bad. And let me tell you why. Because that fueled within me the absolute necessity to fight racism all my life. You see, that's what happens. It makes you firm in your conviction that you will do all you can do as long as you breathe.
Did your family talk about it? I mean, like you give this story about your mom and the back door. When, not particularly that episode, unless you can really specifically remember, but when she would come back, like in those particular incidents, would the family talk about it? I think there's a perception out there that people who were not, I don't want to use the word victims, but in a way that's really what it was, victims of racism. I think there's a perception of those who never experienced that those who were sat around and moaned and groaned about it all day long and all night long. Woe is me, woe is me, woe is me. But I don't think that's the case. Am I correct or wrong?
If one had a steady diet of that particular conversation, one would go mad.
Yeah.
You can't sit around and talk about it. You have to be, because what happens is you are living in a society that was not made for you. And you have, there is a side of this that I think needs to be expressed. When you are born black or different in any way, you have to learn coping skills. If you don't have those skills, you won't make it. But people don't sit around talking about it. It would be like any other reality in your life. there are so many African American families, I've heard this so many times, and other people too, who say, we were poor, but I didn't know it. You know, I've heard that so many times, and that's because people didn't sit around talking about being poor. And they had other things in their lives that were certainly enriching. In our family, we did not sit around talking about being black. We were black, we are black, and there are many things in life that we had to deal with, and as you grow up, you learn how to cope, you see. So you don't know.
No, you know, when you're talking, I'm thinking about my own family, because when you said about being poor, my family came from a minority group of Eastern Europeans, as you know, and we grew up here, in my early childhood years here, grew up in a little small town in Pennsylvania, about maybe 300 people. We still had, looked like Little House on the Prairie, the one little wooden schoolroom, and they drew a line down the room, and in the next town was where, quote, the colored kids lived. But when we went to this little school, they used to put the Eastern European immigrants in one little back side and the colored kids from the little town next door in the other side. And we were extremely poor, and they were really poor. And there was the bond there between these black kids and our kids. And when I'm growing up now, 44 years old, and I think about my past, and I think about what we went through with the taunts and the poverty, I sit there and think, you know what, my childhood should have been absolutely psychologically devastating. Now, there may be people out there who are watching this saying, trust me, he still needs help. But nevertheless, you know, I think, boy, that childhood of mine should have been absolutely horrendous based on the sociological conditions. And you know what? It was an absolutely enthralling childhood because of one major thing. We had an identity. We knew who we were. Maybe we knew that people didn't appreciate it, but we knew who we were. And you enjoyed being who you were.
That's exactly the truth. There are riches beyond the material.
Did your family have any, and I don't want to bring in something negative, so I'll put it another way. Were you raised with having expectations of having a prejudice in return? Were you supposed to be prejudiced towards the Italian Americans or the Jewish Americans or the Hispanic Americans? I mean, growing up in Arizona, there's all the Native American tribes, primarily Apache and Navajo. Were there any expectations on you? No?
My mother and father were God-fearing Christian people, and they lived by the book, and they didn't understand one word of that kind of foolishness. Especially my mother. She just did not, she would not allow that for one moment. I remember when we were living in Phoenix, it was in the 30s, and there were many people out of work. And Mama always cooked enough food for us, and she always had extra food. And she had pie plates. Those are those tin pie plates, and big spoons that were separate from the regular dishes that we used to eat in. And men would come to the back door and knock on the door, and they would want to sweep the driveway or cut the lawn or do something, which she would, and I never will forget this, she always allowed them to do something for their food because it was a matter of their dignity, you see. Now, I just tell you that how could this person who believed in God and who lived by his word teach her children to be prejudiced? And she always said, of course, what every other mother said, 2 wrongs don't make a right. But she also said, you know better. In other words, whatever is done to you, you know better than to repay it in kind. So the answer is clearly no.
It's nice to begin your conversation with honoring your mother, because I know
Yes.
that based on your spiritual principles, which you're going to share with us a little bit later into the show, but I know on your spiritual principles, one of the tenets that you adhere to is honoring one's parents.
That's
and,
right.
and so I always find it so absolutely, I don't want to use the word touching, because that sort of sounds namby-pamby stuff, but I think it's spiritually and emotionally invigorating for me to, when I bring all these guests here, that so many of them have these fond memories of their parents. In this day and age, when people don't seem to speak so highly of their parents, it's real nice to sit here and begin a show where the guest honors her mother. That's nice, that's nice. But I'm going to ask you now to go back a little bit more. I have all these students. I've had over 17,000 students in the past 15 years. And these are kids that have a rough time. And I always know that the majority of the kids, whether they're African American or they're Hispanic, whether they're Chinese or Korean or they're Polish, whether they come from Detroit or Los Angeles or Reno, I always know that the one person that has had such a direct influence in a positive way on their life is Grandma.
Yeah.
Do you have a precious grandma?
Yeah. I had, well, I loved my grandmothers very, very much. And
did they have stories of slavery
Yes,
and
yes.
difficulties, but triumphed?
I'd like to share with you one story, because I think that it's an important story in many ways. I had in my family a woman whose name was Helen Walker. She was my great aunt. And when she was almost 90 years old, she wrote down a story that has literally fed me spiritually all my life. Well, not all my life, when I first heard it, and it has since that time. And that's the story of my great-grandmother. Her name was Matilda, my great-great-grandmother. Great-grandmother. Matilda was a slave, and she was a short, very black woman who sat in a chair like this. And you could tell I have photographs of her, and you could tell from the photographs that she had dignity. Matilda was a house slave, and she took care of the children on this particular plantation. Her husband, James, was a field slave, and he, during the Civil War, ran away to join the Union Army. And word got back to Matilda that he had been, that he was going blind, that he had gotten measles, and he was very sick. And he was in Missouri at this time at a Union camp. Matilda had to get to him. So she left the plantation. She was very short, so she put on baggy men's clothes and a big hat down on her head. And she put a plug of tobacco in her pocket. She was 5 months pregnant when she did this.
Oh, good Lord.
And she had a little boy, William, with her, and he was just a toddler. And in the middle of the night, she stole away from that plantation. And she walked all the next day, fast as she could, sometimes carrying William. And the next day, she had to rest. She went off the road, and she found a place where there was an indentation full of leaves, and there was a log that was over that indentation. She scooped out the leaves, and she gave William herbs that she had brought with her. And this is an old-fashioned thing that I understand was not that uncommon. And the baby sucks on the herbs and will go to sleep and stay asleep. And don't ask me what they are, because I have no idea. But anyway, she gave him those herbs so he would go sound to sleep. And just as she got in this little place and covered herself with leaves and pulled the log back over herself, she heard voices. And it was the son of her master and another man who had come looking for her. And they sat on the log over her with her their feet almost touching her, and they didn't know it. And she heard one say, the son of the master said, "You know, we never whipped Tilly. In fact, Papa wouldn't even let me bring the dogs, because see, she was highly valued as a nurse for these children." And he said, "But when we find her, she's going to get this." And he took the whip out and popped it like that. And then he said, "She sure gave me a lot of whippings when I was coming up." And they sat there for a moment. And then they got up and said, "Well, we better go back. She surely didn't get this far with that little boy with her." And they got up and left. And the next, as soon as she got her strength back, I don't know whether it was the next day or later that day, she got up and went back to the road, and a big wagon came along with these two men in it. And they said, "Where are you going, Sonny, with your little brother? We're your friends. You can tell us." And she explained that she was going on to Rollo, Missouri. And they said, "Get in." And they covered her up. And this was the road that the underground railroad used, you see. She offered them a plug of tobacco, a chaw as they called it, to kind of confirm that she was a boy, not a woman who was expecting. And they accepted that graciously, and they took her to a safe house. And at that safe house, a woman let her sleep and gave her and William breakfast, and had her son put them under some stuff on another wagon and take them to Rollo, Missouri. And when they got there, she saw this man coming down the way, and she recognized that it was her James. And she said, "Is that you, James?" And he said, "Yes." "Is that you, Matilda?" She said, "Yes." And she said, "Can you see?" And he said, "Not so much by sight, but by faith." Oh, and I love that line, not so much by sight, but by faith. Because before he had this experience of running away and joining, he was not a religious man, you see, but he had gained his faith through this experience. And to make a long story short, the baby that she was carrying was my great aunt Helen, who wrote the story down. And they went to Illinois, and James worked for a farmer until they got enough money to buy their own land. And they raised 9 children on that land, and they died in their own beds of old age. And that our family still has that land. And they're still, you know, generation after generation, still right there. Now, to me, she is my heroine. And one of the reasons why I wanted to tell that story is that I think that what helps all people, we don't need, all due respect to public personalities, all due respect to sports figures and movie stars, those are not the heroes and the heroines we need. We need to find the ones in our own families. You see, because that is what makes you feel good.
See, and while you're telling this story, I can't help but try in the right side of my brain to imagine great-great-great-grandmother Matilda And on the other part of my brain, I'm imagining my students, wishing that my students were here to listen to this.
Yeah.
Because I have said over and over and over that I think that one of the reasons, bringing this up to the present, why so many kids join street gangs, so many
That's
kids
right.
are into unhealthy practices and patterns of life, is that they don't know their identity.
That's right.
And our identities come from our family
That's right.
stories.
That's right.
Yeah, that is incredible. That's beautiful.
It takes time to tell stories, though.
And you've passed them on to your family right and left. You have 3 children.
Yes.
Yeah, all healthy.
Thank God.
Yeah,
Thank
spiritually, psychologically. I know
thank
your
God.
son.
Thank
And we're going to
God.
see a little clip of him.
Thank
you
God.
know. Yeah. Taking your family heritage and going past your high school years and on and on and on. You went into education? Was that
Yes,
your
I
field?
did. I went into education and especially interested in the education of minority students because the need is so great. I was vice president for development at Spelman College, which is the top institution for the education of black women in the world, a very fine school in Atlanta, Georgia. And education also gives you hope. But you know, education, laws, all of those are supplements. I always think about Peter. I always think about Peter when I think about what counts. And now I'm going to switch to the spiritual aspect. I believe in education. You know I must believe in education. I'm an education administrator. But I think that there is another kind of education that we really need to have to get past racism. And that is the positive education of who we are as human beings. The nobility that is our birthright when we believe in a just God is the kind of education that we seem to be lacking now. You see, and it must come along with the education that has to do with arts and sciences.
I could imagine, because once again, I was thinking about that story I told at the beginning of the show in 1911 with that man. And if you were the family of that man who was literally drug off the streets, what kind of show, it's just so hard to understand. People have to have a sense of belief in justice. And if your father or your mother or your children were those kind of victims, like that story in 1911, you don't have faith in government, you don't have faith in personalities, you don't have faith in the man-made system. I would only think that that's where people had their faith of justice, was back home in their hearts and in their relationship to this divine creator.
Yeah, I think that's true, but I also think that you know, you can take any kind of story, as horrendous as that is, one or two ways. It can either prompt you to be a fighter, you know, for justice, or it can prompt you to spend your life hating people and trying to get even. And if you have any spiritual sense at all, vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. My job is not to get even. My job is to move forward. And I really believe that one of the issues about racism is that until we get a real hunger for race unity, you see, and until we get it in our heads that all of God's children are noble. Noble. I have created thee. I have created thee noble. I believe that, you see. And so the point is that when we feel that nobility in our hearts, then it is not for someone else to judge us. And our lives should confirm that nobility. And again, I want to go back to Peter, because I think that another part of racism has to do with class. You see, too many people who are from minority communities or whatever often forget that they belong to a group, to, let's just say, a tribe.
Mm-hmm. It's a good word.
You know, it's a good word.
It's being used in
It's a
the
good
sociological
word.
realm now, yeah.
And my point is that with all the education, with all the material advantages, that we have to have certain loyalties. I don't feel that the way to come to racial unity, for instance, is to be colorblind. I don't believe that. I never have believed that.
Mm.
I believe you have to go through color to get above color. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yes, I do.
You have to go through acknowledging that person's culture, background, or whatever, to then be able to go to that higher ground of their humanity. But if I don't respect your culture, your background, how in heaven's name will I respect you? You see? So, and the class part of it comes in this way to me. Remember how ignorant Peter was. He was a fisherman. And the only way he knew the Sabbath day was he'd take his food and he would divide it into 7 parcels. And when the 7th parcel came, he knew that was the Sabbath. Now that, you see, I love that story, because Peter then became the founder of Christ's church. Isn't that true? Mm-hmm. And Christ said that. So, and I always think about that in terms of the potential of people. If we look at a black child and say that child is no good, or a Latino child, or an Indian child, or a Korean child, I don't care. Because in different parts of the world, you know, who's on the lowest rung of society, those names are different. Those people are different. Mm-hmm. So it's according to where you are as to who's the lowest on the rung. But the story, it seems to me that that what Christ was trying to teach us was that the lowest shall be the highest. And I think that every child needs to know that.
There is a woman that you are familiar with that comes from old Persia. Her name was Tahereh, and she is looked upon very much as a great active figure in the emancipation of women. And I use her as an example because she had a wonderful statement that I know of, primarily because my wife tells me all the time, because my wife's Persian, is that she said, now is the time for deeds, not words. Right. In people sitting home listening to you so eloquently speak about the passage you just shared with us, some people may sit there and say, but that's wonderful. This beautiful, dignified, educated black woman speaks so eloquently and beautiful, but really, where's... So I want to show a clip to prove that your words match your deeds. Because you had a distinct honor, and you talk about being an educator, you had a distinct honor. You were, now you're going to have to correct me if I don't have the correct title, you were the president of the World Parliament of Religions that was held in Chicago.
A president.
A president.
There were 4.
This was representatives and people from every religion in the world who gathered in Chicago, and you were one of the 4 presidents.
Yes.
Your primary role, we're going to watch a clip from this, but your primary role?
Well, my primary role was to be there and to speak, and I have to say that another role was to be there to represent women, because there weren't too many of those on that dais. Because
in actuality, I mean, I can count 3 minority statuses that you have a proud claim to. 1, you're African American. 2, you're woman. And 3 is you're a member of a religion that really is in many ways, many people might consider a minority religion, which is Baha'i faith. So here you are, one of the 4 presidents of the World Parliament of Religions, African American, Baha'i woman. Yes? Quite an honor. Yeah? I would think so. I would think so. Is the tape on? Well, that ain't me because I wasn't invited to be a president. Do you have the tape of the World Parliament?
9 days, 7,000 people from all faiths and many nations, solemn spiritual convocations, joyous celebrations of diversity, earnest discussions, plans and hopes for the future. It was the 1993 Parliament of the World's Religions, the largest, most comprehensive interfaith gathering ever held. The Parliament was convened in commemoration of the centenary of the 1893 World Parliament of Religions in Chicago. The original Parliament, the most memorable of several congresses held during Chicago's World Fair, was the site of the first public mention of the Baha'i faith in the Western Hemisphere. People of several other faith traditions also attached special significance to the original Parliament, which opened public discussion between the religions of the East and the West, and is widely recognized as the starting point for interfaith dialogue in the modern world. The comprehensive program included a series of thematic plenary sessions, more than 500 major presentations, seminars, lectures, and workshops, artistic exhibits and presentations, several major symposia, and a variety of auxiliary cultural and religious events.
I see, when I sit here, what the future holds for us. When I look at the oneness in this room.
When man realizes the supreme reality behind, to him, the whole world becomes a family. We are children of the same God, Allah, Brahman.
It is incredible how much the world needs the religions. And this is why this conference is so vital in bringing you together. And I would recommend that out of this conference, we get the definition of a new world spiritual order for the next millennium.
Scientists, scholars, and prominent religious and spiritual leaders were brought together in an attempt to more seriously address the critical issues facing humanity, including the environment, justice and human rights, religious conflict, population growth, and the overarching challenge of creating a peaceful world characterized by unity in diversity.
Much as I question some of the teachings and practices of my own and other faiths, I firmly believe that faith traditions are essential for the human future. You, the leaders of our faith traditions, are the source of our inspiration for what we and Earth can be.
Baha'is from Chicago were among the earliest...
Brings back great memories?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, it was very interesting. It was especially interesting because you had every kind of religious person you could ever imagine in that hall. And when I got up the first time to say something, my thought was, this is what unity looks like. You know, we don't really know how the unity of religions would look like. But when you saw all of those people there, and some very different, you begin to say, well, maybe this is what it's going to look like, at least in its nascent stages.
But Wilma, Dr. Alice, people might sit here and say, once again, African American, women, minority religion. Is it a constant struggle? I mean, have you had it come, repression or victimization or prejudice towards you in all different directions? And in order to get through all, I mean, you told these wonderful stories about great-great-grandmother Matilda and great-aunt Helen. What carries you through as a woman? What carries you through as a Baha'i? What carries you through as an African-American Baha'i woman?
Let me tell you a story. When I was a little girl, my mother was a mother of the church in our church. in Phoenix, Arizona. And she had, our family has always been, as I said, a very spiritual family. And I remember one day when our minister came over. And what I remember about that day, he was a very nice man, was that when he left, he slammed the door so hard, and we lived in a stucco of a house, that it made the door shake. You know, the stucco, Spanish stucco, has the houses have those oversized big doors, and the whole thing shook. And I thought, goodness gracious, what happened? Because we weren't allowed in, when my parents had company. They called us in if they wanted to see us. But what my mother had done was she had become a Baha'i. And her rationale, which she shared with the minister that morning in the 30s, was that somewhere she would find a religion that practiced what Christ taught. She said there's got to be a place. Now remember, this is the 30s in Phoenix, Arizona, where people are not segregated on Sunday morning. There's got to be a place that teaches that God loves all his children and that they're the same in his sight. And she went on and on with the things, and where there was equality of women and men in the sight of God. And she had told him all of these things, and he was furious because she was a staunch member of the church. Now, we went from that to going all the way across the town, walking, by the way, to a little class for Baha'i children. And my mother did not give us an option on that one. She said, you will go. And the difference was that here was a small group of people from various backgrounds, racial backgrounds, cultural backgrounds, class-wise, the whole thing. And we had to come together and learn that there was really one God, his religion, and one people.
I'm going to share a story now with you. I promised you, I warned you that I was going to share this story with you, because I've lived here in Reno for 15 years, and you're talking a story about heroine. My heroines are my grandmas, but that's for another show. But I love history, and I love Nevada history. You mentioned the 30s. Some of the audience members will tell you, Reverend Oni Cooper will tell you, that in the 30s, Reno, Nevada, was considered, actually called the Mississippi of the West.
Yeah,
everybody knows that.
Yes,
was a beautiful woman here, and actually her picture is right behind you. I actually arranged these panels so periodically when I look at your beautiful face, I can see Alice's beautiful face. There was not a large black population here in Reno in the 1930s. There was a woman by the name of Alice Smith who had come from the South, and her husband, John Smith, had moved to San Francisco in the 30s. They could not find work in San Francisco. The prejudice against them, the racism that they endured was abominable. So she came here by herself and tried to get things started. She was even ostracized by the black community here because the black community here was basically Baptist and she was Methodist. And she talks, well, she wrote a great deal in some of her letters how she was so isolated from everybody, the white community, the black community, that she would go and sit down on the rocks by the little creek on Sunday morning just all by herself and commune with God. Anyway, make a long story short, through years, she was one of the founders and major forces in the NAACP here in Reno. But throughout all these years, she worked as a maid. And she started, even as a maid, she started programs like the Meal on Wheel for senior citizens. She did all of these wonderful social economic programs based on her spiritual beliefs. And she used to have this wonderful saying that I say now all the time. In fact, I mentioned it today when something a little went amiss here in putting up the set. And I said to one of the crew members here, oh, but Alice Smith always used to say, I've been called nigger so many times it's like water off a duck's back. She got through that by her spiritual strength. Anyway, we've been working on a documentary about her, and we flew down to Las Vegas to interview two former governors, Grant Sawyer, who recently passed away, who many of us consider to be the civil rights governor, and Governor Michael Callahan, who was the editor of the Las Vegas Sun newspaper. And we were sharing stories. They were telling us stories. And Governor Callahan, I asked him a question, and he verified it. He said that he and Governor Grant Sawyer had so much respect for her. But in the 60s, they couldn't go into a restaurant with her. Even the casinos here in the 60s, blacks couldn't go into the casinos. But they had so much respect for her that they used to call her at 4 in the morning to get policy advice. When the civil rights movement took place, both governors appointed her to major international and national positions here. Here was the maid, black woman maid, still a Methodist, who represented the state of Nevada at the White House for the Conference on Aging, on and on. She passed away about 3 years ago. And there was an elementary school that was just named after her, the Alice Smith School, which is the only school that I know of that my research has shown is named after a black woman in the state of Nevada. So I share that story because here you talk about your childhood of being isolated in a way and being a part of a small group and finding your strength through your identity and your spirituality and your connection to God and not turning into a bitter person when you maybe really had a right to if you wanted to. And here it was the same as Alice Smith. So whether it was Phoenix or Illinois or Kentucky or Reno, Nevada, it's that spiritual connection that keeps it going, that really is there. Have you passed this on to your children?
Absolutely.
Yeah, you tell them the stories?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Now,
I also teach them Negro spirituals. Because, I think that the music, those songs of promise and of pain, it's part of their legacy. You will remember. I think the last time I saw you, I asked you, where is your music?
Yeah.
Because I think that the music plays a great part. And I'm not talking about rock and roll, Joseph. No. I'm not. I'm talking about the music of hope. And our people are so rich. We are so rich in music. And I think that it's one of the things that we bring as black people, bring to the table of the unity of all people. I want to say one thing, however, about racism. My husband is a historian. And he explained something that I think is helpful. Before slavery ended, it went out of style. And what happened was that it was no longer okay to have slaves. I think that today we could almost look at it as, look at how smoking is going out of style. If you smoke, people say, you smoke? Like, what? And those people who do smoke often say, but I'm trying to give it up, because it's going out of style. We've learned not to smoke. Well, the same thing happened with slavery. First in the higher rungs of society, but slowly coming down. As far as social class was concerned, the notion of slavery became an unacceptable notion. And I think that some of that is necessary before racism stops. I don't know that it will ever really be over. But I think that, for instance, this Alice Smith, whom you love so much, she said she had been called nigger so much, it was like water off of a duck's back. You don't hear that word very much anymore. And it's not okay. It's not okay. And I think that our children will benefit from not ingesting so much racism. I used to say that racism is like dust. You have to keep your house dusted at all times. And when I say your house, I mean your heart. Because so long as one feels ethnic superiority, we will have racism.
I have something I want to bring up, and I want you to respond to it, because I want to go back to a little bit more of the educational sociological aspect. In the sociological realm right now, somebody has put together, and I have his name, called the criteria for being a racist. And I bring this up because you use the word superiority. I'd like to bring this up on screen, the criteria for being a racist, and ask, it goes on, Carl, goes on further. We'll come back to that. It should be the next one. Yes, criteria to be a racist. 1, a belief in the existence of biologically distinguishable groups or races in regards to superiority. Obviously, you don't adhere to that.
Well, science doesn't.
Science doesn't.
And science and religion must, truth is one. Truth is one. It cannot be scientifically false and be in any other way true.
And it's the reason why I believe that the New York Times has called that book The Bell Curve Racial Pornography, because that's what that book proposes.
But
that
this
biologically.
is not, at least once every, decade or 2 decades, somebody writes that book. Yeah. That book has been written again and again on the subject of racial superiority. And it has been, Alice Smith says it's not true.
That's right. Let's go to the second criteria. Rank these races in terms of superiority and inferiority. You use the phrase, we're all children of God.
That's right.
God certainly, in your estimation, in my estimation, does not rank us according to our races or ethnic groups in any line of hierarchy.
No, I don't think that one can do that, because in the first place we don't know enough to make any kind of a sound judgment about the gifts that different races have, and they do have gifts. In the Baha'i faith, in the writings, it says that black people are like the pupil of the eye, surrounded by the white, but through which the spirit is seen, or the spirit comes. And each race is given gifts by God. And I don't mean that in some separate way. Right. But the whole notion, Joseph, is that we come together like flowers in a garden. A rose does not want to be a lily, nor does a lily long to be a sweet pea. Now, who is to say which of those flowers is the most beautiful or the best? Put it in another way. The analogy I like is the one of the symphony orchestra. We all are the instruments. We are God's instruments. And it takes that whole orchestra and all those different instruments to make the music of unity. So you see, it's not enough just to say, I don't hate. That's not what I have to learn is love and peace. And that has to come inside.
I'm so good at picking the right guests. Let's go to point 3. Hold these rankings to be intrinsic or innate. Well, obviously, you just answered that. That's obviously not the course of action to be. And then the last, Carl, would you give us the last one? Seek to use them as a basis for discrimination, segregation, or the denial of rights extended to other human beings. When you read this, Wilma, any thoughts go straight from the soul?
The thought that comes to my mind is that the ugly flowers of racism grow on and on. I was just thinking about the fact that Hitler has been dead for over 50 years. That we've had, or I should say, I don't know whether he's been dead or not, but we had I was at the United Nations when we had the celebration of D-Day. And D-Day was the day that we in Europe finally were ready to rid ourselves of Hitler. And yet his ideas, look what's happening with the militia.
Yeah.
Look
Even
what's
today.
happening right in our own backyard.
Right.
And all of that is based on these notions of racial superiority. And I think that people have so much anger
Yeah.
and hurt in them, and the militia are angry with the authorities. These folks feel, what I really believe is many of them feel inferior, therefore they say, let us come together and be superior. And we know we are better than Jews. We know we're better than black people. We know we're better than Latinos. So they are our enemies.
Yep.
You see, but I think that deep down, that comes from a feeling of inferiority.
But see, when you use the word anger, and that's what I see. I see people are so angry that they don't even know what they're angry about, but they have to take that anger out on other people.
Yeah.
And then people like, once again, and I'm going to go back to history, to great-great-grandma Matilda and to Alice Smith. These people, maybe more than anybody today, had a right to be angry, but they chose not to be, because it doesn't do anything but destroy. So I think the solution is to get over the anger. And as much as I appreciate all of the governmental acts and the congressional acts and all of this, they are needed. The Voting Act of 1964 and the Civil Rights Act of 1968 and the Civil Rights Act of 1972 and the Civil Rights Act of 1990 and the Equal Fair Housing Act of 1968, these are all important. But unless we get over our anger, those acts are external. And I think of Leo Tolstoy's statement that when he said religion is external and spirituality is internal, well, it's the same as all those wonderful acts, unless we get rid of that anger and become more spiritual. I want to go to a more recent period of history before we actually open it up to questions that the audience members may have. Where were you during the LA riots?
Are you talking about the ones that just happened or the ones that happened in the Watts riots?
Well, which one was the strongest for you?
Watts.
Watts. Where were you?
I was in San Jose, California at that time, and I was working at Stanford University in Palo Alto. And I was there, and I shall not forget that, because I hadn't been there very long. And I felt like I should be back home in Los Angeles, because I moved from the Southern California to Northern California. What was very, very hard for me was the mixed feelings I had, because I knew people who were from Watts and who had been in business in Watts for years, but they couldn't. Whose buildings where their businesses were located, they had wanted to buy, but they couldn't buy them because they were black. And the owners, when the owners sold the buildings, they would not sell them to black people. And yet it was those businesses that were making those buildings valuable. So the problem to me was that I had such a mixed feeling about it, don't you see? And in one place I felt like, I thought, isn't it terrible? Look at those neighborhoods. I went to that park. I know that place. On the other hand, I thought, let it burn. Let it burn. Let's start all over again. You see? And even though you could say, well, now, Wilma, you're a Baha'i. You believe in racial unity. You believe in the oneness of all people. How could you say such a thing? I'm telling the truth, that as a black person who knew that area well and knew the injustices, it was hard not to have mixed feelings.
Where were you during the recent LA riots over I think the first, actually there were two, but the first one was of recent time was during the Rodney King episode.
Yes, I was on the East Coast.
You had an office at the United Nations.
Yes.
You were your official title at the United Nations was?
I was Administrator General for the Baha'i International Community offices in New York and Geneva.
Which really represented, I understand, about 5 million Baha'is of every nationality, ethnic group, race, and all this. In fact, you had another, besides the World Parliament, you were in charge of another major international event that brought, I think, about 30,000 people from every country in the world to New York City on Thanksgiving weekend at the Jacob Javits Center. And I want to ask you to just speak briefly about that, because there is a specific reason why I'm going to bring that up.
Well, I was the convener of the program committee for that activity, and then ultimately one of the 3 coordinators for it. It was the World Congress of the Baha'is, period. And we did that in 1992.
I want to tell you why that to me, because we'll show a little clip later on. I'll edit this in for those who wanted to see it. There was a procession of people from every ethnic group, racial group that you could imagine walking up into that podium as a family of mankind.
Oh, that's beautiful.
What touched me so much was, now after it's all over, not only to see the array of mankind there together, but just a little after that major event, there was another event there, and I'm going to be real honest about it, as you were just honest. There was another event there from the Nation of Islam by Mr. Farrakhan, where the same equal number of people met to denounce people of different races and nationalities and ethnic groups. And I studied that ferociously, that event. I mean, I read and devoured the newspapers and the magazines about it, because it was such a contrast to me. Here was 25,000 people in the Jacob Javits Center, same place, denouncing everybody that's ever walked the face of this earth practically, and yet just a little bit before that was 25,000, 30,000 people of every race and nationality who were there to celebrate the oneness of mankind. It's a fascinating, where this world, where this country, where people are at. And once again, to me, it all goes back to this concept of anger and this concept of spirituality. I didn't see any anger at the one I was at, but I don't know how much spirituality was at the one I wasn't at. I don't know. I want to open it up to some questions from the audience, and then I want to come back in closing, because I have a monograph that I know it's been distributed all over the world, and I know that directly and indirectly, and I'm going to ask you to talk about it, you had a voice in this, which is called The Vision of Race Unity. And I want to spend a little bit of time discussing that, because, once again, I don't believe in closing the eyes to the past pain, because then we do become blind to it, as that statement goes. But I want to always present a solution to some of the pain, and not a solution of Band-Aids, but doing some real surgery to eliminate and eradicate this disease called racism. I just want to know, does anybody have any major questions for Dr. Ellis? The audience is not mic'd, so what I will do is, if you will just shut out your question real loud, and then I will repeat it, because I am mic'd. Reverend Cooper.
My question is to Dr. Ellis, since we are living in very unrestful times, if you had something to offer for the people who are haters, young or old, and the people who are drug users, what advice would you give?
Okay, I'll repeat for the sake of the camera. What advice would you give to the people, maybe even primarily the younger people of this generation and age, like drug users and all of that? That particular
Well, you
illness.
see, I think, again, let me just say that we have to be able to put our consciousness around the notion of our own nobility. I believe that the statement, "Noble, I have created thee, why doth thou abase thyself?" And I believe that that statement has to be ingested. And people who are on drugs, and I have had too much experience with that, having to deal, especially in schools, they're looking for something. They feel empty. And what they're looking for, in my honest opinion, is God. It is a spiritual disease. And one of the things that proves it is that drugs affect everybody. The richer you are, the better cocaine you can buy. That's all it means. If you do not have, if there is a spiritual vacuum, if you cannot find God within, if you don't know how to pray and seek His solace, then you're apt to do anything. I believe that violence is caused by prejudice. I didn't say that. The Baha'i writings say that. That the reason that we have violence, and it gets to be a major part of our society, is because our society is riddled with prejudice, you see. So I think that what I have to say is that to people who use drugs, to people who are haters, they too have to answer to God. They too, someday they will die, and they will answer to God. I believe in the hereafter, you see. So I believe this part of our spiritual journey is but one part. And we will all go on. And it is up to every single soul in this day and time to find spiritual food that will feed them and will stop them.
And I don't mean to be repetitive, but I'm going to repeat myself because I work with teenagers all day, and after that you do tend to develop this pattern of repeating oneself. I know that my students who say, well, they use drugs and they are involved in unhealthy patterns, as I say, because I really truly believe there's no bad kids out there. We're just healthy kids that develop some unhealthy patterns. That many of them will say forthright that they use the drugs to numb their pain. And I'm going to take it back to your story and to my story. Great-great-grandma Matilda, wonderful, wonderful heroine Alice Smith. These people were in pain. They did not numb themselves with cocaine or morphine or heroin or marijuana or the booze. You know, where would have been your great-great-grandma Matilda? She would not have been able to think properly to do what she did if she had riddled her body with cocaine. You know, Alice Smith had a choice. She could have sat home and walloped in self-pity and drank the whiskey and said, woe is me, I'm a black woman, and even some of the black people here don't like me. Or she could have went out and said, well, I think I'm going to do something spiritual today. I think I'll invent Meals on Wheels for senior citizens and go out and do that. So,
well, I feel that we all have that choice. And I feel that we pay the consequences for it. And I don't feel that, you know, that there used to be a poster that said, this little black boy, and it said, God doesn't make junk, and God made me. I believe that. But I also feel that we as senior members of this society, we have a role. And that role is to love our children and to love other people's children. You see, what I see too often are children who the vacuum is created in them because they don't feel the love. TV cannot raise my child. My child needs my arms around him and her. And they need to feel the softness of my bosom. You see, and TV can't offer that.
Before I take another question from the audience, I'm going to show you one of Dr. Ellis's children. This is someone that I admire so much. Would you roll the tape?
It was the country's worst urban violence in over 100 years. In the United States, the city of Los Angeles was well nigh consumed by the flames ignited by racial division on the 9th day of Rizwan. In sad fulfillment of Abdu'l-Baha's prophetic warnings during his visit to the American continent 80 years ago, the city convulsed in agony under the pall of 5,000 fires, 44 deaths, 2,000 injuries, and $1 billion in property damage. Images of the turmoil were broadcast live to sickened audiences, punctuating the warnings of the Universal House of Justice of the serious dangers posed by the rise of racism in many parts of the world. The Baha'i community was not exempt from the effects. The Los Angeles Baha'i Center, purposefully located in a neighborhood of ethnic diversity, became the center of a firestorm, as most of the buildings around it were left in charred ruins by angry mobs. Miraculously, the center itself survived the conflagration. In the aftermath, the Baha'is were quick to come to the aid of their neighbors. They quickly organized teams of volunteers to help clean up the tons of debris and to restore a sense of dignity to the barren urban landscape. Food and clothing giveaways helped those most severely affected by the destruction. Baha'i psychologists organized free counseling services for neighborhood children and others feeling the trauma of witnessing civil and moral order evaporate before their very eyes. These events added a powerful impetus to the bold new initiatives for race unity launched over the last year in communities all across America. As a result, Baha'is are increasingly recognized as a leading force for solving racial problems.
If they're united. I read the statement on race unity. For those of you who have not read it, may I recommend it to you. It is a beautiful statement, and it is very, very cogent. Read it.
We thank God for the Baha'i community and for the contribution you make continually to each one of us.
The National Assembly sent an open letter to the President of the United States, which was prominently published in New York, Washington, and Los Angeles newspapers. The letter strongly urged up government efforts to address America's most challenging issue before the nation's cities are reduced to rubble. Meanwhile, Baha'i communities continued to work to unite the hearts of their fellow citizens at the local level.
Baha'i communities have been asked by police departments, by mayors, by human relations commissions, by a state attorney general, by major corporations, and by a variety of other agencies to assist in a wide range of ways in eliminating racism and promoting race unity.
In the Deep South, the Baha'i initiatives even managed to unite two separatist groups. The irony of the incident was so significant, it became the top story on the local TV news.
What in the world would put about 30 members of the Ku Klux Klan side by side with these folks from the Pan-African International Movement?
Spreading the word, no.
The uniting force is these members of the American Baha'i Religious Group and their annual March for Race Unity Day.
Baha'is believe in the unity of mankind. Everyone's the same because God made us all.
Marchers seem to have no problem with the uninvited guests.
I'm glad that they had to get together to come protest us. We did our job. We're bringing people together.
There are about 300 marchers here. Organizers say this may be the single largest show of ethnic unity in Hillsborough County history.
Baha'is are involved in the widest range of activities in the service of their communities to promote understanding, to bring groups together, and to demonstrate the models of racial, ethnic, and religious unity Baha'u'llah came to establish.
Racism, just undo it.
Robert Henderson is your eldest child, yes? Someday when I am old, and if anybody bothers to ask me any questions about my heroes, I shall tell stories about Robert Henderson, because I just absolutely adore that man. One of the statements that those people spoke about in that little clip is called this: Can you get a close-up of it, Mark? It's called The Vision of Race Unity, America's Most Challenging Issue. Let me ask you first, why is it called the most challenging issue?
In the Baha'i writings, it says, it so states that racial unity is the most challenging issue in this country, and it says that we will not have peace. And when we say we will not have peace, I mean in the world. We will not have world peace until this issue is solved. And I have to say to you, Joseph, for those who are listening, Baha'is don't claim to have all the answers in our individual lives. I like to think of the Baha'i community as a workshop. It is not a showplace, because it's made up of ordinary people from every part of the world, all kinds of folks. But one of the things we are committed to is walking on the higher ground of racial unity. Unity is our byword. It is what we believe in. We believe in oneness. And so, you see, we have to keep working at it. We have no choice, because if I tell you I am a Baha'i, then I am telling you that one of my primary values is the oneness of all people.
But the argument also may be from some, is that in trying to establish this oneness of mankind, does that mean you have to forego your own racial heritage and identity?
No. As I told you before, the way, at least to me, it seems that one must honor our differences, our cultural differences, our ethnic differences, in order to come above them. If I can't see who you are, honestly, and know that you are from a different background than I, then how in the world are we ever going to come together? What am I going to do, pretend you're black? That's not doing either of us a service. It's not realistic. But when we work together for racial unity, then you truly become my brother, you see, and I become your sister, or something like that.
One heart at a time.
One heart at a time. But I think we're going to run out of time if we try to do one heart at a time. I think we have to do masses of hearts at one time. But I can say this in all sincerity, that no community in this nation has a track record like the Baha'i community, because we've been doing it ever since there was a Baha'i community in this nation. You see, we've never had it any different. In the South, we have integrated meetings. We've always had integrated meetings. We do not give up our principles because it's not expedient at this time, you see. But people come into the faith with all their warts, you know. But when you are in that community working for unity, that's how you learn to get over racism. And the question I ask everybody is, what are you going to do when your child comes home and with friends you have never seen before, you don't know whether they're black or Indian or Asian or whatever. These children get to know one another, and they get to liking one. In fact, they even marry. Can you imagine that? So the point I'm making is that we cannot afford racism. Just like slavery went out of style, racism has got to go. This is the day for unity.
I was telling you at dinner time, my oldest daughter, Anissa, I asked her to share with you a story about her best friend,
yes,
who was an African-American girl who was a very devout Jehovah's Witness. And Anissa is European, Eastern European Persian, who's a devout Baha'i. And when I see these two girls together, they're like the hit of the school. I mean, you know, they have so much energy, and they see each other's culture, they see each other's religion, they see each other's ethnic and racial heritage, as Anissa explained to you at dinner, or shared with you at dinner. They teach one another. But there's just no animosity there. It's just such pure, joyful energy of two young teenage girls making their way through life, sharing each other's spiritual and religious and ethnic beliefs and identities.
But what you don't know is Anissa told me all about her friend. And she told me that she was her best friend. She told me that she was Jehovah's Witness. But she didn't tell me she was African American.
Yeah.
I think that they've gone beyond that. She didn't mention that. And I don't think that she didn't mention it on purpose. It just wasn't important.
Because there's just that love.
That's
but
right.
there's that recognition. But it's not necessary to put those identities or labels. I want to bring this to a close by actually saying thank you to someone that I know that many people sitting here today in the studio are familiar with, and perhaps not too many remember her on a daily basis. I do. And I say this in all honesty, and I've never shared this with anybody, and I've shared some pretty good secrets of my life with people, but I'm going to, because of your specialness, I'm going to share something with you. I told you about my past, and I've shared little bits and pieces with you about my past in the past, and I was raised to be prejudiced. I was raised to stick with your own kind because it was a protection. And in order to have that instilled in me, to stay with my own kind, I was told the negative myths about the black kids, the colored kids down the next town. We didn't grow up in a place where there were Indians or Hispanics, but ours went to the Poles and to the Serbians, and most worst of all to the Protestants and to the Jews, and on and on. But my grandma always used to, at 2 o'clock in the morning, 7 days a week, get up and make homemade bread. And through the house, homemade bread would filter through. And so I would get up and I'd go sit down in the kitchen with her, hot tea and hot homemade bread, and she would tell me, don't pay attention to anything that this family is telling you. Just pay attention to God. And her and I would sit there, and there would show in the middle of the night in this dinky little town, Mahalia Jackson's midnight showing.
Yes,
and every night, Mahalia Jackson sang.
Yes, she
and
did.
I attribute my quest to eliminate and eradicate any prejudice in me to Mahalia Jackson. And even my kids will tell you, when I get up in the morning, get ready for work, they hear Mahalia Jackson singing from my bedroom, from the tape recorder in the boombox, because all these years later, I say, if there was one person in this world that brought me a little bit closer to God, it was Mahalia Jackson. So in my own little way, I'm going to dedicate this program to Mahalia Jackson.
Well, you will have no argument from me. When you said that, the words came to me. I played Mahalia a lot. I heard her in person, and I'll never forget it. It was in Laverne, California, and the microphone broke, and it made no difference at all. That's how big her voice was. And what it came to me was her song, which I love so much, where she says, "My God is real, for I can feel him in my soul." And I always love those words. They give me great comfort. So you see, we do share a love.
Thank you so much for coming on behalf of all of us here. Really, thank you so much for being a part of this. Hopefully we've maybe just even, somebody's flicking the channel and one person stops and listens and they think, I think I'll just no longer think in any way, shape, or form about prejudice.
Just remember that racism is out of style.
Maybe we'll name this show, Racism That's Out of Style.
Yes.
Thank you, Wilma. Thank you very much.